Hello, I'm Lauren Huberman.
And I'm Christina McLean. Welcome to All Access.
In this episode, we honor National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Throughout October, we recognize the many contributions that people with disabilities bring to the workplace. We know that people with disabilities have so many skills and talents they bring to their work each day. However, the unemployment rate of people with disabilities remains twice the amount of people without disabilities. For this reason, we use National Disability Employment Awareness Month to raise awareness and share information to employers on how to be more accessible and inclusive to individuals with disabilities.
As we honor National Disability Employment Awareness Month and continue to raise awareness, we are excited to share a conversation with Emily Ladau. Disability rights activist, speaker, and author Emily Ladau has been a disability advocate since age 10, when she was invited to appear on Sesame Street to increase visibility and help other children with disabilities feel represented. Emily has received numerous awards for her leadership, impact, and achievements. In 2021, Emily published her first book, Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally, which can serve as a guide for how to discuss and understand disability. Emily continues to work on demonstrating how every issue is a disability issue and to destigmatize disability, offering hope and making the world more inclusive and accessible. Emily is an editor for Able News and is co-host of the Accessible Stall podcast.
Well, Emily, thank you for joining us.
I am so glad to be with you guys.
So we're going to get right into it because we have a lot to talk to you about. But we wanted to just start off by learning a little bit more about you and your family because, we are the mayor's office for people with disabilities. We also wanted to talk to you about your disability and your advocacy work. So would just love to get started by learning a little bit more about you and your disability. We've read that it is also something that your mom and your uncle have, and just want to talk to you about your experience as someone with a disability and, how your journey was different than maybe your mom's or your uncle's.
Yes, disability is a family affair in my life. So I have a genetic physical disability. It's called Larsen syndrome. It's a joint and muscle disorder. So I use a wheelchair to get around. And my mom, as you mentioned, has the same physical disability, as does my uncle. So I very much grew up understanding disability to be part of what it means to be a human. That being said, my mom grew up 30 years pre-ADA, and then I was born just after the passage of the ADA. So there's this 30-year gap between us, but it really feels sometimes like a century when you think about how far disability rights came in the time between my mom growing up and me being born. I have never known life without laws like the ADA in place. Whereas, even though the disability rights movement was very much going strong in the 60s, in the 70s, there was no social media, there was no major news coverage alerting my mom and her family to this fact. So she did not grow up with this same sense of connection to disability as an identity that I did. Even though it was just part of our experience, I was the one who really ended up leaning into disability pride as I got older and embracing disability as a part of my identity. And I recognize that that is a privilege in and of itself to have grown up in a time when that was possible. But now my mom says that I have brought her at first kicking and screaming and now very happily into the realm of recognizing disability as having a history and a culture and an identity.
Yeah, that's great. It's so good to see that progress and be able to talk about it with someone, who's so close to you. And I want to talk to you. I have two small children at home. So I want to talk to you about your experience on Sesame Street, how it set you up as an advocate or how you used your experience as an advocate at such a young age on Sesame Street.
It's a great question. And I think the most important thing that I like to underscore for people is I realized the power of that experience more so in hindsight than I think I did when it was happening. At 10 years old, I don't think you're conscious of the fact that you have been given this national platform to educate about disability. But at the same time, I think a lot of the reason why I wasn't so heavily conscious of all of that is because I don't feel like I was treated as a token as much as I was, yes, the disabled kid in the neighborhood. I also felt like my experiences were very much respected. The writer of my introductory episode, Emily Pearl Kingsley, who is an advocate in her own right, along with her son, came to my home and worked with me and with my mom on crafting a script that felt really true to who I was at that time as a 10-year-old disabled kid. And I think that set me up for understanding that my experience matters and that who I am as a human being is worthy of representation. Because before that, I really hadn't seen much representation of disability at all. There was another young girl who used a wheelchair who was on Sesame Street before me. But other than that, I had two books that I would read over and over again with characters with disabilities in them. And I flipped through constantly because that was the only place that I saw myself. So after having the opportunity to be in some small way that representation for other people, I think that experience really carried through for me throughout all the years I've lived so far, where I've realized how important it is to be reflected back at yourself, to know that you belong in a story just as much as anybody else. And it was cool to hang out with Oscar and Big Bird and Elmo, and Grover too. So I can't complain. It was um really an incredible experience, but I think it was also something that really opened my mind up to just how important storytelling can be.
Wow, that is so cool that you got to hang out with all of them. I think those are really interesting reflections, especially the piece about how you didn't realize the power of that experience, but in hindsight, it's something that stands out to you more and that you felt like you weren't being treated, like you said, as a token. Do you think that representation has gotten better, like in the media, in movies and TV shows and that type of thing?
I am always the type of person who looks at representation as there being two rolls forward and a roll backwards. That's what I have noticed time and again. There have been immense moments of progress and there have been incredible accomplishments in the media. And then you'll still flip on the news and see that the last story at the end is that kind of inspiring or tragic or pitiful, cliche version of the disability experience. Or you'll see an incredible film that has accurate disability representation nominated for several awards. And then immediately afterwards, there will be another film that comes out where it's a non-disabled person playing a disabled character. And so I think that, yes, there's been so much progress. And I also think that I see the same mistakes made over and over and over again, often because it's what makes money, it's what sells. It will be what garners clicks. It will be the kind of thing that will be successful during award season. So I think that there's been a lot of movement forward, and there's also been a lot of staying stagnant or going backwards. And so it's really the kind of thing where disability representation tends to hang in the balance in the media.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your book, Demystifying Disability. Will you describe your book and share with us why you wanted to write it?
For sure. So my book is, in my mind, meant to be one offering in a sea of so many perspectives about disability and the disability experience. I always say that demystifying disability was not meant to be the encyclopedia on disability. It was not meant to be the Bible on disability. That's simply not possible because I'm one person out of more than a billion people. And I exist at this nexus point of privilege and marginalization. I am someone who is disabled, yes, but I'm also a white woman. I'm someone who comes from a strong family support, middle class background. I'm someone who identifies as the gender that I was assigned at birth. I'm someone who communicates verbally. So all of these things are privileges that coexist alongside my physical disability. And because of that, there is no way for me to encompass the whole of any disability experience in my book. My goal instead was to provide a tool, a resource, a foundation, an entry point into a much bigger conversation about disability because people are often afraid to talk about disability because they don't know what to say. They're going to say the wrong thing and they're afraid that they're going to get in trouble. And I don't think we give ourselves a lot of grace to make mistakes and learn from them in this world. So my hope was to provide people was something that they could go to where they felt like they were in a bit of a safe space, not being judged, able to get some of their questions answered, and then take that knowledge, whether it's about the basics of disability language or etiquette or representation or history, and then turn around and say, okay, I at least feel more prepared to begin the conversation. No one's ever going to be an expert on any experience other than their own experience, but they can at least have some of that background, that foundational information that will hopefully lead them into a more comfortable pathway of engaging about disability.
Yeah, and at the beginning of your book, you ask readers to think about the word disability and what it means to them. Can you share with us what it means to you and how this word and its meaning has impacted your life and career?
I try to describe disability pretty straightforwardly as a natural part of the human experience. And I know that that is not a definition that necessarily encompasses the physicality or the cognitive aspects or the emotional aspects of disability. But I do think that it is the most concise way to explain what disability means to me. I know that there is a legal definition, of course, but at the end of the day, I want to make sure that we are recognizing the humanity of disability. And I think that has been a driver in all of the work that I do because when I was younger, despite being outspoken about disability at times, it was still a huge compliment to me if you said, "Oh, I don't think of you as disabled," or, "Oh, I forgot that you use a wheelchair." And over time, I began to realize that when people were saying that to me, what was supposed to be a compliment was really just erasing an entire part of my humanity. And when I got to college, I remember sitting in a meeting and one of the professors who was there said something to the effect of, "Oh, it's person with a disability, not disabled person, right, Emily?" And that was, believe it or not, the first time that I had ever grappled with the idea that I shouldn't just call myself a disabled person. And I know that seems strange to say, especially in a world where we talk about language so much, where person first language and identity first language, saying person with a disability or disabled person is such a deeply personal choice, and neither is wrong and neither is right. It's just whatever feels correct to you and your personal preferences. But for me, nobody had ever really said disability is a bad word. But at the same time, there had been all of these implications that disability is a bad thing. So I existed in this strange sort of balance of I'm not afraid of the word disability, but I don't really like identifying as disabled. And then it started to all come together for me as I got older and realized disability is part of who I am. I want you to recognize that. I don't want you to erase that. I just want you to recognize that it's another part of what makes me me.
Yeah, and Emily, you had shared that you kind of brought your mom along with you in terms of bringing her into that, disability pride space and being proud. What do you mean by that? Why was she hesitant?
I think that so much of it has to do with the same thing I felt. It wasn't necessarily that disability was a bad word, but it was that the concept as a whole was a bad thing. So you could call someone disabled or when she was younger, handicapped, but it wasn't about the word itself. It was about everything that accompanied the word. It was about the stigma that was attached to it and associated with it. And my mom never had access to people modeling what it meant to not just use the word disabled, but use it boldly and proudly and to use it as something that they were not afraid to say. So for me, as much as I had to learn about what it meant to lean into disability pride, I had access to the resources to do that as I got older. I was connected to people on social media. I began to engage with, other disabled people who had already learned the history of disability, who could pass that wisdom on to me. And because my mom hadn't had access to any of that, I was then the one who in turn relayed that to her and said, "Did you know that there was this whole world of activism and of history making going on while you were alive, but you just didn't have access to that?" And so I think it really opened up a world for both of us to lean into disability as something we were proud of as an identity.
Another thing that you talk about throughout your book is how society should adapt to people with disabilities instead of the other way around, which usually happens where people with disabilities need to adapt to the environment in which they're in. Just wanted to get some insight on how you feel that this has improved over time and what work, is still left to be done.
Absolutely. So, really, this comes down to what's known as models of disability. And there are many models of disability, but two that are most commonly discussed are the medical model and the social model. And the medical model really looks at disability as something that is a problem of the person. It is something that is wrong inherently within someone that needs to be fixed, cured, eradicated. And then there is the social model of disability, which says that it's not about what is happening within a person, it's about what's happening in the environment around that person. So it's the environment that's disabling, it's society's attitudes towards disabled people that is disabling. And most people would say that it's not possible for either one to be 100% true because disability is absolutely about diagnosis. In many cases, it's about having access to the medical supports that you need. It's also about the fact that environments are inaccessible and that people have attitudes that are stigmatizing towards disabled people. I always say that you can create a law like the ADA, but you can't legislate an attitude. And so, as long as laws exist, but we haven't shifted people's hearts and minds, we're still going to be largely disabled by society because society is inaccessible to us.
So the work that we do at the MOPD Career Center is, of course, we work with job seekers with disabilities in the city of Chicago who are seeking employment. We also help to support them once they have employment, and we also work with employers around inclusive hiring practices and building inclusive cultures. So, some of what you just said really resonated in terms of how do we shift attitudes. And when we think about employment specifically, I mean, that's one area that's seen the least amount of advancement since the passage of the ADA 34 years ago. So why do you think this is? And what would you tell employers about hiring people with disabilities? Or in your mind, how could we move the needle and start to shift those attitudes?
I think by and large, the discrepancies in employment numbers between disabled and non-disabled people really does still come down to stigma and misconception. I think that we have much work still to do in debunking some of the most basic myths around disability and employment. The assumption that it will be very expensive to provide accommodations, the assumption that disabled people are not capable of performing in a workplace. And much as I would like to, you know, aspire to a world where we didn't attach worth to productivity in the workplace, I also want people to understand that disabled people absolutely can be productive members of the workforce, but we have to shift our thinking from these rigid ideas that I think a lot of employers still hold about what productivity and efficiency and high performance in a workplace looks like, and instead say, well, what if we created a workplace where everybody had access to the supports and resources that they needed to thrive and to do the work in a way that works for them? And then you will see success among not just disabled employees, but all your employees, because everybody has support needs in a workplace, whether you identify as disabled or not. So it's not so much to me about how do we fight back against these big, broad systems. Right now, it's about how do we shift people's attitudes. I do believe systemic change is incredibly necessary, but I also think that if I can change one person's mind at a time to better understand why hiring a disabled person is not somehow going to be a detriment, financially or otherwise, to your company, that to me is what's most important. I'm very much about making that human one-on-one connection with someone and saying, whatever things that you are holding on to, whatever myths that you believe, let's debunk those. Let's go through those. Let's sort through that. There are absolutely systems in place that are creating barriers to employment as well. Perfect example is the fact that many transportation systems are inaccessible. Either people technically have public transportation available to them, but not in a way that is usable, or they live in areas where there are no accessible transportation systems. So, yes, there's absolutely systemic barriers, but we also need to push back against the attitudinal barriers. So it's not an either or, but I'm very much the type of person who wants to tackle the attitudinal barriers. And I think that that's how dismantling the systemic barriers will ultimately follow.
Yeah. What advice would you give to some of our job seekers at our career center? Like, obviously, you don't know them, but we work with a lot of different job seekers at our career center. And yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what advice you would give to someone who's looking for a job and has maybe been looking for a job for several months.
This is so challenging for me to answer because some of the advice that I've heard and some of the advice that I've also given that I think people are tired of hearing is, not to put your worth in finding a job, and also not to feel discouraged or defeated or give up, but at the same time, what I sometimes really wanted to hear was, you know, don't settle for someone who doesn't accept your disability. Don't feel like you need to twist and bend yourself and become a pretzel to make yourself fit into the molds that employers want. you know, so much of the advice that's out there is you keep pushing, you keep, pursuing the job opportunities. But sometimes I think it would just be nice to hear you as a human being still have worth and value, regardless of the stigma and discrimination that you may be encountering when you are seeking a job. And I know that it is tough out there. It is tough out there. And sometimes, having someone just say, yeah, solidarity, I get it. I hear you. I recognize that you are navigating a challenging landscape. I think to me, that is almost as comforting as the typical advice. But in terms of more typical advice, maybe a hot take here, but I really believe in disability disclosure where, appropriate and legally viable, because I don't want to work in a place where they don't know that I'm going to show up as my whole self, where they don't accept that I'm going to show up as my whole self. And there were definitely times where I came up against that, where when I disclosed my disability, that was what shut the door on the opportunity. And so it might seem like bad advice, and people might say, well, I tried that, and now I feel like I should hide it. But at the same time, you're only denying yourself the opportunity to be who you are. And you're also potentially denying yourself the opportunity to receive the supports and the reasonable accommodations that you are legally entitled to in order to perform your best in the workplace. So, my real practical advice is be your whole self. That might be scary. It might mean the doors are going to be closed on you, but you're going to find that place where being your whole self is welcome, celebrated, accepted, and you are given the supports you need to succeed.
Yeah, I think that's such a hard topic. And it is something that we have 4 career placement counselors currently at our career center, and they all have these very individual conversations with job seekers. And I think it's a really complicated personal topic. And of course, it depends on the person's disability as well. I hope that we can get to that place where there is less stigma and people feel more open about disclosing and sharing. I mean, particularly if it is an invisible disability. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your perspective. I think it makes a lot of sense that you're saying, you want to be part of a place that values you for your whole self. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that.
So we know that you have been interviewed quite a bit. Just wanted to know if there's a question that you've never been asked that you want to answer.
Oh my goodness. I feel like the questions that I am asked really run the gamut. So I'm lucky that people have really pushed me to think outside the box sometimes. But I think the most important question to me is, just about who are you as a human being outside of navigating advocacy and outside of a career. Because I mean, as much as, I can give actual career advice all day, I also want people to understand that they can, take that work hat off at the end of the day if they need to, and just be themselves outside of that context. And that's especially hard for me because my work and my identity, the personal and the professional, are deeply intertwined. Probably the biggest question is really just, who are you outside of this context? And then I would just tell you that I'm someone who is, a theater going, you know, nerd who is very happy to just sit with my partner at the end of the day and watch Survivor. And, I mean, we're all allowed to be people outside of these other contexts.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's great. So what's next for you? And do you have anything exciting coming up?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of work actually in the cultural access space. That's something that I'm really passionate about. I love as I just mentioned, the theater. I'm also a big fan of museums, and just any cultural venue or institution brings me an incredible amount of joy, but they're also often not accessible. And my work passion and my priority is really to combine everything I love about media representation and accessibility at cultural institutions and destigmatizing disability, and combine it all together and just provide that support for institutions that are focusing on becoming more accessible to disabled people. So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, and I'm pretty excited about it.
So we like to wrap up our conversations with getting some career advice for our listeners, since our podcast is really centered around careers and wanting to make sure that we note this as it's National Disability Employment Awareness Month in October. What advice would you give any of our listeners or followers on becoming, if they're interested in advocacy or writing, what would you suggest for them?
Be unapologetically yourself. You don't owe anybody an apology for who you are and for the space that you take up. At the same time, you don't owe anything of yourself to anyone either. And it is entirely your decision what you choose to share, when you choose to share it, and how you choose to show up in a space. So remember that even if this may not always be true and it seems a little bit idealistic, I want people to understand that you are in control of your narrative and that you are worthy of taking up space and sharing your story as feels right to you.
I love that. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your story, sharing your experience. We definitely learned a lot. And it was an honor to get to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. Thank you for joining us for this month's episode of All Access. Be sure to check us out on social media at MOPD Chicago.
Special thanks to our executive producer, Commissioner Rachel Arfa, the City of Chicago's production team, our sign language interpreters who helped to make our podcast accessible, and our special guest today. See you next time.